All right, let's get started. So in part 2 of our series of controversies in liver disease, JP, we had a little speaker switch, I think, with our podcast.
We had a little speaker switch today.
JP is going to discuss the impact of alcohol in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So there's some recent interest in this. Thanks.
All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about low to moderate alcohol use in patients with NAFLD. I mean, the question really is, should these patients, obviously heavy alcohol use is out of the question, but how about low to moderate alcohol use? What's the data out there? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it meh? Doesn't matter. So we'll try to, get into the bottom of it. All right. So first, let's talk a little bit, the first few slides, just a little background on things. So global alcohol use, 55% of all adults worldwide consume any alcohol in their lifetime. This is based on WHO data. And there's really also a wide geographic variation in consumption. As you can see in the US and Europe, more than 3/4 of the population used alcohol at some point in the lifetime, whereas those in the Eastern Mediterranean admitted to less than 5% in their lifetime.
Those are the Muslim countries.
Correct. So that's why I was careful to say admitted to 5% lifetime use.
There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world.
Yeah.
I assume most of those are teetotalers.
Correct.
Most, but not all.
Correct. So, why do we need, so in terms of alcohol consumption, we have to define, and try to standardize alcohol consumption. We have to standardize units. And the reason for this is threefold. One is, well, for research studies, there has to be some uniformity. Second, in terms of policy making for public health and also educating our patients, we have to be able to give them a sense of what one unit actually means. And as you know, a regular person would define alcohol consumption in terms of specific beverages, a can of beer, a bottle of something, a shot of some distilled spirit. But, in the market, all of these beverages have different concentrations in volume. So, adding more to the confusion of what does a unit of alcohol actually means. In the U.S., the NAFLD and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDHHS, defines a unit as any drink containing 14 grams per 0.6 fluid ounces of pure alcohol. And that's the U.S. definition. Here at the bottom, where's that? Here you go. Here at the table, you can see that in different countries in the world, their definition of a unit varies from as little as about 9 grams in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, UK, to as much as 23 grams in Japan. That's their definition of one unit. In the US, what's in a standard drink, therefore? So that's about 12 fluid ounces of regular beer, 8 to 9 of malt liqueur, 5 fluid ounces of wine, and 1.5 fluid ounces of any distilled spirit. And this is, I lifted this from the NAFLD website and the USDA. Now, alcohol use, we all know, has associated harms. Worldwide, 3 million deaths are attributed to alcohol. That's about 5% of all deaths worldwide. In the US, it's about 85,000, or 3.5% of all deaths. That's the third most common frequent cause of death in the United States. Only tobacco and a physically inactive lifestyle, poor diet are ahead of it. 50% of liver-related deaths are from alcohol, 25% of liver-related hospitalizations from alcohol, and 24% as of 2016 of all liver transplants in the U.S. are because of alcoholic liver disease. And based on this data, it's actually officially overtaken Hep C as the most common indication. $250 billion in costs, 130 million disability-adjusted life years associated with alcohol. So you could say that excessive alcohol leads to harm, and these are some of the possible diseases or illnesses that we could get from alcohol. So heavy alcohol use, in my opinion, definitely out of the question in NAFLD, and we'll go over that later. So by definition, NAFLD means non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it's the presence of fatty liver steatosis or steatohepatitis in the absence of significant alcohol use. In trials, significant means that it's more than or equal to 21 drinks, which we defined earlier, per week in men, or more than 14 per week in women. But in real life, there's really no good definition of what significant means. how many people
We
with
usually tell
NAFLD?
our patients half of that, because they usually.
They will double it. They'll double it.
JP, can you go back to that?
Yeah.
So when I gave the talk on this earlier this year,
Mhm.
you know, this comes from a trial in Scandinavia, right? Denmark, where the curve, when you get past that threshold of about 3 drinks
Mhm.
per day, the curve of the risk of developing
I have that.
disease, right?
Yeah.
Starts to change at that point. Okay. But it doesn't mean it's linear, it's 0, and all of a sudden it goes up
Correct.
there, right?
Correct.
And so the problem with, I think, and this is something I've talked about many times, you know, in these conferences, and probably a lot of people are rolling their eyes about, you know, the impact of alcohol in terms of inclusion criteria here. It's probably more significant than we think.
Right.
You know, you add that to pre-existing liver disease, and I don't think it really applies very well. For, you know, and I think that's one of the problems here.
And actually, it varies from countries. Actually, when I talk to my French colleagues, they say 5 a day. 2 for lunch, 2 for dinner, 1 at bedtime. That's normal,
Yeah.
you know, for typical French.
And they're all wine, of course.
Although their glasses are probably smaller than the glasses that
Yeah,
we
their
use
portion
here.
size.
The
is
pores,
very
Right,
big.
smaller
it's a little
pores.
different, so.
Right, that's why French women don't get fat. Right?
Now, how many people with NAFLD actually drink? In the Dallas Heart study of 655 adult men and women who had steatosis, 64%, 66%, or about 2/3, are non-drinkers, and 34% drink something. Now, I mentioned earlier that heavy alcohol use out of the question in NAFLD. So in this study by Naveau, it's a cross-sectional study of 1,600 adults with take note, alcoholic liver disease in France. Being overweight is associated with 2 to 3 times higher odds of having cirrhosis, alcoholic hepatitis, or just steatosis. Another study by Hassan. This is a case-controlled study in MD Anderson. They got 115 cases with HCC and 230 controls with non-HCC cancers, being in MD Anderson. And here you see the interaction between having diabetes, which as you know is strongly associated with NAFLD, and alcohol use. And if both are present, the odds of having HCC is up to 10 times more. Here, of course, you could see that having viral hepatitis and alcohol, the synergy between the two, 54 times more. But just having diabetes together with alcohol, this 2 combination increases your risk or your odds of HCC by 10 times. Another study from cancer, another case control from LA County, 245 HCC cases, 220 non-HCC controls, demonstrated the same thing. Having diabetes and drinking more than 4 drinks a day increases your odds by 17 times. So excessive alcohol coupled with having risk factors for NAFLD or having NAFLD also increases your HCC risk.
Did they find a difference between blacks and whites?
This one,
I mean, it's in their title.
correct. So they did, but I wasn't able to, I can't remember the numbers from the top of my head. I apologize.
I think HCC is increasing faster in black men,
Mhm.
right, in the U.S. I think I saw those numbers
Or
somewhere.
they're getting diagnosed, they're getting treated less.
They're getting treated less, but the prevalence is increasing. Or the incidence.
The incidence is increasing. And lastly, this is an animal study, but what they did was they overfed mice with a high-fat diet to induce NASH, and then they exposed these mice to either low-dose alcohol or high-dose alcohol. They did a weight-based, mice are tiny, so they did a weight-based alcohol regimen, and they looked at histologic NASH and fibrosis. And here you see that the overfed mice who had a lot of alcohol, more steatosis, some steatohepatitis actually too, and the reticulin stain you could see more paracellular fibrosis. So this combination is really bad, and in this combination alone or just alcohol alone. So again, the synergy between the two. So we talked about heavy alcohol use, but how about low to moderate alcohol use? Is it beneficial? Is it harmful? There's this question: is there benefit? And that question of benefit for low to moderate alcohol use comes from some studies in non-liver diseases suggesting a J-shaped curve, so that at low doses of alcohol, there might be some survival benefit, but at high doses of alcohol, of course, that benefit goes away in these patients. These people suffer from more bad outcomes. So this meta-analysis of 87 observational studies involving about 4 million individuals, they divided alcohol consumption into lifetime abstainers, and I'll talk later, this is an important distinction, being a lifetime abstainer. I'll talk about that later. Former drinkers and current drinkers. And then among the current drinkers, they stratified that into daily consumption in grams, and they looked at all-cause mortality as their outcome. And here is the odds, the relative risk at different levels of alcohol. So the x-axis, you have increasing levels of alcohol. The reference group are the lifetime abstainers. And then here you have the former drinkers at the other end. And here you see that at these low doses of alcohol, and going back at our definition, 12 gram per drink. So this is about 3 to 4 drinks per day. This is about 1 to 2 drinks per day. You see that the relative risk for all-cause mortality is supposedly lower.
I would say supposedly, I would say significantly.
Significantly, yes. Thank you. Significantly lower. I mean, you could actually see that the confidence intervals are actually relatively narrow. Pretty good.
Yeah.
And I truncated this. It's 0.0004.
4 million patients.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Less than 1.3, so that's like what, 1 drink every 2 weeks.
So this is about once a week.
Yeah.
Between one and less than once a week.
Once every 10 days.
Yeah, once every 10 days.
And that's worldwide.
What's that?
Is that worldwide?
Yes, they looked at studies worldwide. All right. Another one for the BMJ, another meta-analysis, but this time the outcome that they looked at is cardiovascular mortality as well as incident and fatal CAD and stroke. They say any alcohol consumption compared to lifetime abstinence improves some CV outcomes. All-cause mortality, CV mortality, CV-specific mortality, incident coronary heart disease as well as fatal coronary heart disease, and they reduce their risk by about 10 to 30% based on this meta-analysis. Similar idea, the J-shaped curve, alcohol use from 2.5 to about 15 grams per day, so it's about 1 to 2 per day, also is associated with a significantly reduced risk of, and this is just, sorry, I apologize, this is just for incident strokes. The data points for these other outcomes is that any alcohol use, so it's actually more, it's not necessarily linear, but it doesn't have the J-shaped curve. So as you go up on the alcohol consumption, then the risk of these go down. So there's no J-shaped curve. But for stroke, they have a J-shaped curve. So lower to moderate doses, you have a significantly lower risk of strokes than higher doses. Our colleagues in cardiology did the same thing, but this is a single study, a big one. It's a prospective cohort of the National Health Interview Survey, followed them up for 8 years. Again, divided it into lifetime abstainers, former drinkers, current drinkers, as well as binge drinkers. They looked at these outcomes, and this is an estimated curve based on their analysis, and this is log transformed hazard risk for all-cause mortality in the y-axis, and in the x-axis you have current alcohol consumption in drinks per week. And so in individuals who consume, maybe 10 to 15 drinks, 0 to 15 drinks per week, or 0 to 2 drinks a day, have a lower hazard for all-cause mortality. But they did say that if you drink heavily or if you binge drink, then you have worse cancer and all-cause mortality risk. So this is an interesting, I find this as an interesting meta-analysis. So Jürgen Rem's group, they looked at 17 observational studies involving 1.5 million individuals. These are people, without known liver disease. They then looked at lifetime abstinence and current drinking, and they looked at cirrhosis-related mortality and cirrhosis-related morbidity. So in terms of cirrhosis-related mortality, this is the relative risk, and this is alcohol consumption. The way they did it is actually much easier to understand, because if you look, they did it in multiples of 12. So you could say this is 0 to 1, 1 to 2 drinks, 2 to 3, and so on and so forth. And the reference group is still the lifetime abstainers, and For mortality, you could see that for men and women, as the alcohol consumption goes up, then the relative risk goes up. But as you can see here in the men side, which is orange, it doesn't really go up, or the slope doesn't pick up until maybe after 2 to 3 drinks per day. But in the women's side, even after 1 to 2 drinks per day, the slope considerably picks up. But as Jean pointed out, it's not zero and then all of a sudden it goes up. It's a slow, gradual upslope. And then in terms of morbidity, however, we could see that for men here, between 0 to 36 grams per day, the relative risk is actually below 0. So you know, that's why they were, you know, this paper is a little controversial because it's suggesting that you know, low to moderate alcohol use is associated with a lower risk of cirrhosis-related morbidity, at least in men. Maybe you know, at a lower dose here at 0 to 12 grams per day, maybe in women as well. But as you can see, the confidence interval, however, did cross the, you know, unity line. So
Can you say a little more about the database that they're working? How are they defining cirrhosis, and how are they ascertaining mortality and morbidity?
right. So they use they looked at different observational studies. So it's a meta-analysis. In terms of defining morbidity and mortality, I mean, they kind of just look at, I guess, the easy way to say it is just however these papers wrote it. In terms of the alcohol consumption, however, they did a lot more like transformations. Very few studies, you know, none of the studies have similar descriptions. You know, some do weekly consumption, some do daily consumption, some do in grams, some do, you know, what, so on and so forth. And they made some assumptions about what 1 unit means in that specific country, and kind of combined everything to come up with this classification of alcohol use at the bottom. And you know, they didn't really go into much detail as to how exactly they define or morbidity and mortality. I'm sure if I look at the paper again, the tables would show how these were specifically defined in each study, but I can't remember off the top of my head. All right, now, so we talked earlier about cardiovascular disease, about maybe some potential benefit of low to moderate alcohol use in cardiovascular disease. And since we're talking about NAFLD, it's worthwhile to talk about cardiovascular disease in NAFLD. So CVD and NAFLD are associated with each other because they have common risk factors, particularly the metabolic syndrome. However, there's some thought as well that NASH may promote CVD itself because of systemic inflammation and the release of these atherogenic mediators, as well as the induction of insulin resistance and dyslipidemia. But overall, at least in patients with NAFLD, CVD dictates outcomes more than liver disease. And so, you know, the thought is, if you have an exposure that modifies CVD risk, then maybe it will modify NAFLD risk as well. And here in the Mayo data collected over 20 years, ischemic heart disease causes 25% of all deaths in NAFLD patients, second only to malignancy. Breast liver disease is only half of that. Now, what are the possible cardiovascular protective effects of alcohol? So there have been a few small randomized crossover trials of alcohol in men and women. So in this trial, you have 51 women randomized to an 8-week regimen of no alcohol, 1 drink a day, or 2 drinks a day. And what it showed was, as we go consumption, fasting insulin goes down. MFFM is an index of insulin sensitivity. That goes up. And these changes were independent of obesity and BMI. So this is for postmenopausal women. There was another study on middle-aged men. So you have 23 middle-aged men. They were randomized to 17 days. One group got 125 milligrams of whiskey every night. The other group got tap water. I don't know how. Sorry, but it's not blinded. But what they showed was there was increased adiponectin in both groups with alcohol. But in the insulin-resistant group, there was a trend towards improved insulin sensitivity. So these randomized trials kind of give us a sense of, this is a possible way how moderate alcohol use can exert its cardiovascular protective benefits. Now, what is the data on low to moderate alcohol use in NAFLD? So most of them are epidemiologic observational studies, more commonly cross-sectional than prospective. They have varying definitions of NAFLD, and the outcomes are mostly related to histology, like fibrosis, steatosis, steatohepatitis, ballooning, and whatnot. I really didn't see a lot of studies that look into clinical outcomes, like mortality, decompensation events, HCC. I wasn't able to see a lot of studies on that. Although, if we get some information about fibrosis progression, then I guess we could somewhat extend that and extrapolate that a surrogate to worse outcomes down the line. So when we talk about studies on alcohol use in NAFLD, we have to discuss about important methodologic issues. All of these studies have design limitations. Obviously, we can't do a well-designed prospective RCT. It's just not ethical to assign patients to patients with known liver disease to alcohol use. There are prospective trials, but there are few, small, and involve short-term alcohol exposures, which may be enough for biochemical changes, but not clinical outcomes. And as I mentioned earlier, since most studies are cross-sectional, you could get associations, but not really temporal associations.
You should, regarding your first point about prospective RCTs, I mean, I don't know if you saw in the news, there was actually a big controversy about the leadership in the NAAA who set up a prospective trial of low to moderate alcohol use, but the problem was that it was being funded by InBev and the alcohol industry. So even though there was some sort of reported influence on that, that trial was stopped. Actually, it got a lot of bad press. So I actually think
Heineken is good for it.
yeah, well, the idea is trying to assess whether or not 1 to 2 drinks a day can affect cardiovascular risk, and if obviously it was a positive study, the implications of that are huge, right? So, I mean, I think the ethics are, I wouldn't say it's unethical per se, because it tried to happen, but I think maybe not with the beverage industry. That's all.
Yeah, those guys own everything. Yeah, they own Heineken, Budweiser.
Wait, which company?
InBev, Hennessy, Cognac, Dom Perignon, Champagne. They like 60% of the market. From Joe Sixpack to sipping Dom Perignon, they got it all covered.
Since most of these studies are, observational, there's always a risk of confounding. Abstainers and moderate drinkers may have different characteristics, like unknown, unaccounted genetic behavioral traits. And some are saying that moderate drinkers tend to have or experience a clustering of more healthy behaviors. In fact, in this survey of 250,000 adults, 90% of CVD risk factors 27 of 30 CVD risk factors are more common among abstainers. Only smoking and male sex are more prevalent in drinkers. So this is this has to be taken into account when we're talking about observational studies in this particular topic. Recall bias is an issue. You obtain alcohol use of patient reports. Also, subjects are often obtained through whatever patients remember, but also there's reporting biases because subjects may have a tendency to underreport alcohol use, especially if their population is derived from a liver clinic. Then they will just underreport it. As Dr. Dietrich mentioned, when we educate them, give them half of the definition. Alcohol use is also defined in terms of average consumption, and some of these studies fail to consider happy episodic drinking or binge drinking. Now, the Shaper hypothesis is something that we have to consider in these studies. So basically, in the set of all abstainers, sometimes they include people who are. So if they only consider current abstainers if they only consider current abstainers, they run the risk of including this set of people into the whole group of abstainers. Also possible that some people who abstain are sick or old. They want to change their behavior because of something. And the problem with that is, and the Shaper hypothesis is that alcohol consumption decreases as people age or become ill. And the effect of this is that absence of alcohol or abstinence reflects poor health rather than true disease risk. And that misclassifying these people falsely elevates the CV disease risk among abstainers. So the next few slides will go through some studies looking at the low to moderate alcohol use in the NAFLD population in particular. So the first one from Australia, this is 105 obese adults. It's a cross-sectional study. They all underwent bariatric surgery. They have biopsy-proven NAFLD. They define alcohol use as current drinking, stratified as grams per week of alcohol. And what they found was, as the alcohol consumption increased, they found that the prevalence, the frequency of steatohepatitis, diabetes, and Mallory-Denk bodies also went down. And that any alcohol consumption is associated with the decreased odds of NASH as well as diabetes. The only thing with this study, though, is, they set a limit. One study didn't set an upper limit. All right, the next study by the group of Dr. Dunn. So it's a cross-sectional study of 500. Yeah.
So it seems, so you're looking at the ratio of black to gray, right? And once you get up to the 100 to 200, they're the same as each other.
So I'm looking at the ratio of like black to black.
Right, because they're saying what? So the percent of patients.
No, it's the number of patients with steatohepatitis, diabetes, and Mallory bodies decreases.
Decrease with higher
alcohol increases up to 20 drinks a week, basically.
So you're comparing the same shades of gray to each other.
I was
They're
interested.
loading out their livers, that's why they don't have any fat or
Focus on alcohol, whatever that alcohol effect.
That's possible.
You saw that in that whiskey study, right?
Yeah.
With adiponectin. I mean, it is many shades of gray.
Yeah.
Not quite 50, but.
But it's also kind of strange that the proportion of the different elements that you're looking at varies across the, in some you have the grays almost the same as the black.
It levels here.
Yeah, so what's going on there? I guess
Well,
the
maybe
answer.
if you continued it out, the J shape or the U shape would continue. So if you increased alcohol consumption,
Oh yeah,
double
true.
that,
True.
right? Then
Then you'll see that
going
it
back
starts
up.
changing here. It naturally goes up.
But
The numbers are really 22, like 19.
Yeah, just 20 drinks
9.
per week.
They have no livers.
So this is a cross-sectional analysis of the NASH CRN of 582 patients biopsy-proven NAFLD. They looked at lifetime alcohol use. They excluded heavy drinkers, former drinkers, and binge drinkers. And modest alcohol use was associated with lower odds of more advanced histologic disease. So, maybe 30 to 40% decreased odds of having NASH, ballooning degeneration, Mallory-Denk bodies, and fibrosis. So this is a pretty significant reduction in odds associated with modest alcohol use. I do want to point out that this is cross-sectional, however. And later on, I'll discuss some studies that are prospective.
And JP, go back. So if you look at the one further,
Okay.
you say excluding heavy drinkers, right? So it depends on what your definition. This kind of goes back to your previous slide, right? So I mean, in the EU, it's been established that 10 grams of ethanol is really considered one drink. That's in the labeling, which you have here in the States. So in this study, did they use the U.S. definition that you proposed from the NAAA of 14 grams, or did they use 12, or did they use
Yeah.
10?
So if you use 20, they probably use the European lower limit. Because if we're thinking that this is like 2 drinks a day, so it's about 10 grams per drink.
Yeah, my point is, I understand that they put 20 grams, but they're not going to ask the patients,
No.
are you drinking 20 grams or 12
no.
grams, right? They're
Right.
asking about drinks.
What's the
right?
unit that they used?
Exactly. So I doubt that they're using 14 grams, because that doesn't
It's very
make
small,
sense. How
yeah.
are you going to say 1
Yeah.
point whatever drinks
Right.
per day,
Right.
So
Yeah, so
Probably
they're
using-
10.
they're probably saying 1 drink a day.
No, I think it's probably 2, but they're
No,
assuming
2
10.
drinks here, but they're excluding 20, or greater than 20.
Greater
okay,
than,
so
yeah.
2 drinks max.
More than 2
Right.
drinks.
Okay.
So they're using the lower
Right.
equivalent.
They're just rounding off. You're
Correct.
getting 9.2 grams.
Michigan did another cross-sectional study, biopsy proven as well, 77 patients. They looked also at lifetime alcohol use. They used a different unit. They looked at grams of alcohol per years of drinking. 24-gram years. And their definition of heavy drinking is 40 grams per week, which actually, you think about it,
That's 4 drinks a week.
that's not a lot.
That's, yeah.
So what they said was lower body fat and fibrosis score in patients who consumed more alcohol. So those who are abstinent for more than a year, their body fat percentage is 41%. Those who consumed more, only 33. And comparing those who this. So by the way, they used 24 because this was the median. So they just did like below and above the median. And the mean fibrosis score in the biopsies was also higher in those who are abstinent and in those who consume alcohol below the median. And when they did a multivariable analysis, patients who consume this much alcohol had a lower adjusted odds of advanced fibrosis of about 70%. Granted, the p-value is barely there because the sample isn't really that big, and the number of people who consume this much is also not that big. This is a Japanese study. It's a prospective cohort, more than 5,000 adults. They used ultrasound steatosis. That was their definition. They also used current alcohol use, not lifetime. And there was no mention in the article about excluding heavy drinking or having a limit.
There's no such thing in Japan.
That's right. Because you remember, in Japan, their unit is 24 grams. That's crazy.
Yeah, ask people who have gone to business dinners in Japan. It's insane.
So they looked at odds of NAFLD by alcohol consumption. In men, they showed that increasing alcohol use lowered the odds of NAFLD. In women, there's no clear correlation with alcohol between alcohol consumption and NAFLD.
280 grams a week.
Well, that's
like
28.
alcoholic liver.
That's 28 drinks a
I mean,
week.
you don't have NAFLD.
That's
you have
4
something
drinks a
else.
day.
I don't know how they make the distinction between NAFLD and
Well, that's
alcohol.
4 Japanese drinks a day. So that's really 8,
So-
right?
Well, there's a grand.
American drinks a day.
Yeah.
No, that's not. No, yeah, that's 280. So that's 28 drinks a week.
Yeah.
That's like 4 drinks a
Or 2 drinks a day in Japan.
day.
So and also Dr. Grable, so with this prospective cohort, they actually use sonographic NAFLD. So this is not bias proof.
How are they making that? That's an all diagnosis to make. They all have alcoholic liver. I don't know.
Yeah, true. Because they're looking at steatosis.
How
So.
are they calling it NAFLD?
Right.
Yeah, they should just call it steatosis.
Yeah, exactly. Steatosis.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is from Scandinavia, cross-sectional study again, 100 adults, also biopsy proven, lifetime alcohol use. Their definition of heavy drinking is more than 14 drinks per week. Kind of a little similar to our, how we define it. And basically what they're showing here is the dots represent the units of alcohol. The dots represent each person. The y-axis is the units of alcohol they consume in a week. And then the x-axis is the fibrosis stage. And then we see a trend towards lower alcohol consumption with increasing fibrosis stage. And so they, on their regression analysis, they've said that each extra drink per week will decrease the odds of a higher fibrosis stage by 14%, with an odds ratio of 0.86. The nice thing about this study is they actually address the issue of underreporting. So, on top of looking at the history, the report of the patients, they actually measured PEth levels. And patients with a PEth more than 0.3 had worse histology. So they had 3 times the risk of advanced fibrosis and more than 17 times the risk of a higher NAFLD activity score. So I think this highlights the limitation in some of these studies, because when they talk about alcohol consumption, it's self-reported.
Is that the same units that we use here in the US?
I think we use milligram per.
Because I was going to say, I got one back that was like 12
Yeah.
recently.
It's different units.
I think it's different units, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the cutoff here is, I think, 50 or 25.
What do they say about age? Do they take age into account in all
these?
Yes, and so in these multivariable analysis, they look age, gender, metabolic syndrome risk factors as well. All right. So the previous articles were kind of suggesting that maybe there's benefit to low to moderate alcohol use, but the next articles that I will present will suggest that there actually is no benefit to any alcohol use in NAFLD and might even be harmful. So the first one is from Scandinavia as well. The nice thing about this is that they have paired liver biopsies and they have biopsy-proven NAFLD followed over a mean of 14 years. They also look, because it's paired, they have 2 data points. They also look at how alcohol use has changed between biopsies, and they also included binge drinking. So in this group, 45% had no change in fibrosis, 17% had regression of fibrosis, and 38% had progression of fibrosis. And these fibrosis progressors demonstrated more harmful drinking patterns. They consumed more alcohol per week, and they also had more frequent binge drinking. And in multivariate analysis, which adjusted for demographics, metabolic syndrome risk factors, and all of that, binge drinking increased the odds of fibrosis progression by 42 times. Granted, the confidence interval is huge, but 42, I think, is 42. It's huge. This is a similarly designed study. This was recently published in CGH. 285 adults in the CR network, and they also have paired biopsies and biopsy-proven NAFLD. They looked at lifetime use. They excluded patients who consume more than 2 drinks per day. They also excluded former drinkers, and they excluded binge drinkers. In this study, 41% of patients were non-drinkers, and 60% had some drinking, which is similar to the Dallas Heart study that we showed earlier. So, up to maybe 2/3 of patients, a half or so of patients with NAFLD actually drink something. Now, patients who are moderate drinkers at baseline had lower prevalence of NASH at baseline, so 57% versus 74%. Whereas lifetime abstainers at baseline over time showed better improvement of steatosis, more frequent NASH resolution, more weight loss, but no effect on insulin sensitivity and lipids. Now, what happens when you look at how their drinking has changed over the follow-up period? Consistent non-drinkers, when you compare them to consistent drinkers, had twice as more frequent NASH resolution, and they also demonstrated more improvement in steatosis, ballooning, and NASH activity score in the biopsies. On the other hand, modest drinkers, they started as modest drinkers and then became non-drinkers. If you compare them to those who consistently drank, still had more frequent NASH resolution and still had greater improvement in steatosis and histologic activity.
Now, did they control though for weight loss? Right, because people who stop drinking frequently lose weight.
Right. So in the multivariate analysis, they controlled for BMI.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry. What am I doing? Now, how about those who consistently drank? If they did that, if you compare them to consistent abstainers, they had a 70% lower likelihood of resolving NASH and a 75% lower likelihood of improving steatosis. Now, the other thing, so this study, the point of this study is to show that there might not be a significant benefit to low to moderate, a significant cardiovascular benefit to low to moderate alcohol use. So this is a prospective study, cohort, 570 young adults. Definition though is radiographic. These are patients who are enrolled in the CARDIA study. They had 30 years of follow-up. The purpose of the CARDIA study is to look at determinants of subclinical determinants of cardiovascular disease. So their outcomes here are cardiac structure and function in the echo, the coronary calcification score, and all of that. And over 30 years, these enrolled patients went to 9 examinations. So they assessed alcohol consumption during 3 of these examinations or occasions in the 10 years before the CT of the abdomen was done. If the patient says that they did not consume alcohol on all 3 occasions, then it's a non-drinker. If they consumed less than 21 drinks a week in men or less than 14 in women, then they're moderate. Any report of more than 5 per occasion is binge drinking. Their definition of heavy alcohol use is more than 21 drinks a week in men and 14 a week in women, and they excluded these people. In this population, 42% did not drink, 58% drank. 74% remained abstinent all throughout 3 observation periods, whereas 75% remained as moderate drinkers during these 3 observation periods. What they found was that the drinkers, and this is at baseline, drinking at baseline was associated with a lower likelihood of metabolic syndrome. But overall, what they concluded was that alcohol consumption was not associated with these subclinical markers of cardiovascular disease and multivariate analysis. So these were some of the subclinical markers that I was talking to you guys about. I'd like to juxtapose these findings with the other study, the small randomized trials, which showed that low to moderate alcohol use, which showed that short-term exposure to low to moderate alcohol was associated with improved insulin sensitivity. So that was the other study, and that was short-term exposure, and you have improvements in insulin sensitivity. The difference is this one, so this is more long-term exposure over 10 years, and their outcomes was more of like for some markers of cardiovascular disease. So what I'm saying is in terms of maybe modifying cardiovascular determinants, it's really unclear if alcohol is doing anything.
Actually, I've got to go. Before I want to tell you this story about the binge drinkers, because it's important when you're telling. So I told this guy he had some mild liver disease. So I assumed he's going to double it. So I go 7 drinks a week. How much to say? I go 7 drinks a week. So he comes back a month later with his wife. He's like furious, at him. And she goes, "Doc, did you tell him 7 drinks a week?" I go, "Yeah." She goes, "Well, he saved up for 3 weeks and he had 21 on Saturday night." It's like, well, you have to be a little more literal with some of these quotes. It's like you use them or you lose them.
Right.
It's like, right. Yeah. So it's like, yeah. So I think binge drinkers always do worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Always. So people like that guy, we'd rather not drink for a while and then go wild.
Right. All right. Last study that I have. So this is a prospective study, 510 adults in Cleveland Clinic. They had, their NASH was defined histologically, but also clinically. So by clinical, it's rule out, it's defined as elevated LFTs, rule out other causes, and risk factors for metabolic syndrome. So that's their clinical definition. Follow these patients over a median follow-up of 3 years. They looked at lifetime alcohol use. So they looked at forever abstainers. They looked at social drinkers. This is their definition. They looked at current and former significant drinkers, and these are their definitions. But if you look at the results of the study, really the amount of drinking doesn't matter, because what they're pointing out in this study was, here the solid line. So the outcome is HCC, incident HCC. So on the y-axis, this is the proportion of the group that has HCC. The x-axis, this is the years after the diagnosis of cirrhosis. Patients who, the solid line, this is the group of people who are abstainers, lifetime abstainers. These lines, this is the group of people who are either social drinkers, who are former significant drinkers, or current significant drinkers. And the point here is any level of alcohol consumption increases HCC risks in patients with, and something I forgot to mention earlier. So these NASH patients are cirrhotics. So they ascertained that these are cirrhotic patients with NASH. And any alcohol consumption in these patients will raise their HCC risks up to 4 times. And it doesn't matter how much they drink. It could be social, it could be former, it could be, significant current. It doesn't matter. The risk of HCC is similar for all 3 and higher than the non-abstainers.
Does it increase the risk of all types of cancer or just HCC?
So for this study, they only looked at HCC, but my guess is it's actually all cancers. Because if you look, again, going back at the causes of death in patients with NAFLD, the leading cause of death is malignancy. 28% of them die of malignancy compared to 25% with ischemic heart disease. So all that 28%, I mean, they're not all HCC. I bet some of them are colon cancer. I bet some of them are, some other GI cancer. All right, so in summary, lifetime abstinence results in greater improvement of NAFLD histology. Moderate drinkers who abstained are more likely to have improvement in their histologies than those who continue to drink. Binging is associated with the worst outcomes. So they have more frequent fibrosis progression, they have worse histologies. Moderate alcohol consumption has equivocal effects on cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular markers. As we showed earlier, short-term exposure may improve insulin sensitivity, but long-term exposure doesn't do anything to coronary artery calcification or cardiac structure and function. And if someone is already cirrhotic with NAFLD, any alcohol use will increase their HCC risk. So, how do we translate this to practical recommendations for our patients? If someone has NAFLD and they're cirrhotic, I mean, our recommendation should really be simple. Abstain from all alcohol use. They have a higher risk of HCC. And even though I did not present this, I'm, intuitively, the risk of decompensation is also higher if they keep on drinking. On the other hand, what if they're not cirrhotic? I mean, if they're not cirrhotic and they have never had anything to drink, it is silly for them to start drinking for cardiovascular benefits, because they could get those benefits from other means. If they are current moderate drinkers, it's a little bit more tricky. Should they continue or should they abstain? I mean, some of the data says, it's either not harmful, maybe even beneficial, but some of the data says that it's harmful. So it's unclear. But, and it's unclear, we just need to be transparent with the patients and tell them that we don't know. And of course, we'll probably color it with our own perception of what they should do. But if they decide to continue drinking, then what they should do is they have to consider the calories from alcohol in their daily caloric averages. So the key to treating NAFLD is weight loss, hypocaloric diet, increased physical activity. So if they will continue drinking, the calories from drinking, that's 7 calories per gram of alcohol, should be included in their daily limits. Because otherwise they'll keep gaining weight. Personally, this is what I would personally favor complete abstinence. So like I mentioned, you color it with your own perception. And I say this because the nature of hepatotoxicity of alcohol is still multifactorial. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of unaccounted risk factors out there, genetic, physiologic, behavioral, environmental, that we don't know about. Second, the layperson has different interpretations of serving size. What's like a serving of beer? What's a glass of beer? What's a bottle of beer or a glass of wine? They have very different interpretations of that. Like educating them about that, you have to be extremely clear. Otherwise, there's a big room, like as Dr. Dietrich is pointing out, a huge room for misinterpretation. Second, thousands of beverages in the market. Each one has different alcohol volume, different alcohol content. It's just very, how many of our patients have actually looked at the ABV or the proof or whatever. And third, cardiovascular benefits can be obtained through less risky means. I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier, don't do moderate drinking because it could help your cardiovascular health. Just diet, do exercise. These things are safer and probably have more benefits through more systems of your body. And that's it. Thank you.
JP, questions, comments?
So what's the predominant means that a population will define as a? So why is Japan? Why is it so high?
Why is what?
In Japan, why is it so high?
So my guess is there's some cultural aspect to it, but again, I don't know. Yeah, sorry. That's my guess. Is really the cultural aspect of why it's all so different. That's all I could think of at the moment, which is unfortunate because you have all these studies from, which also, if you look at some of the meta-analyses that are more international, they settled at using grams per day instead of units because they had to adjust at where they looked at the definition of a unit, in the country where the study was done. So they made that adjustment. But you know, I mean, in the studies it's standardized, but if you go out there, you know, in the real world and start talking with patients, like, then it becomes a little problematic. Like, you know, how do you say a regular drink in Japan, a regular drink in the US, a regular drink in Canada? It's a little bit more difficult to, unfortunately, define.
I would just add sort of two thoughts. One is that in looking at studies, I always try to look at the year and think about how the year the study was done intersects with the rise in obesity and type 2 diabetes. Because these analyses are being done on a backdrop of a changing population.
Correct.
So I think that's important. One of the reasons I asked about how things were defined, mortality and cirrhosis, I find these things very difficult to define when I look at medical records, and I think there's a large opportunity for misclassification.
Absolutely.
And there's a study that I presented when I spoke earlier this year, where there was a cohort of about 30,000 patients with known hepatitis C. And when they died, the people looked at the death records, and even in the case where the death record said liver disease, not alcohol related. Now, these all had hepatitis C. 66% of the people who had that, it wasn't mentioned that they had hep C.
Oh.
So, of course, all those deaths are going to be thought to be NASH. Like, what if it's liver death, no mention of viral hepatitis, and it's not alcohol related, that all those deaths are going to count
as NASH. Cryptogenic NASH.
And across the board, hepatitis C was only reported in 20% of the death records. And again, even in cases like it was barely mentioned, like 2/3 of the patients who had HCC on their death record did not mention hepatitis C, even though they had a
that was underlying.
Yes. So I think you have to be so careful about how things are defined, or you really can't make sense of what is being presented.
Absolutely.
So taking that concept further, you used one of your strongest statements was in NAFLD in general, that you suggest abstaining based on sort of your evidence that you presented. Does that include NAFLD without NASH, or does that include only NASH patients that have elevated liver enzymes, presumed NASH?
Right.
There's a difference.
There is. The natural histories are different. I mean, in theory, I would. A lot of at least some of the studies that are biopsy proven actually look at NASH in particular. You know, those studies that looked at NAFLD as a whole are really poorly defined because they used imaging. They did not use biopsies. Those that did use biopsies actually looked at steatohepatitis and fibrosis. So that's their definition. And so, you know, the verdict is out there whether the simple steatosis patients who doesn't have fibrosis or who doesn't have steatohepatitis, can they drink or can they not?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the NASH case is a little clearer.
Yeah, the NASH is
stronger, whereas for NAFLD it's a little weaker.
Yeah, it's a little questionable.
I would also end by saying there was just for completeness sake, there was a Lancet study that came out from a group of collaborators called the Global Burden of Disease group, where they look at population level data, right? And they do this every 2 or 3 years, right? So they just published one about alcohol, and I don't remember all the details, but the key point to that was the attributable mortality to alcohol in older individuals, age greater than 50, was primarily cancer. Okay? And you presented a lot of data about, you know, liver mortality outcomes, cardiovascular. There's a J-shaped curve that's been reproduced many times, but cancer takes some time. You know, that one of the longitudinal studies we presented was 8 years. Probably takes a little bit longer than that, you know, to sort of demonstrate that sort of impact. So we don't necessarily think about alcohol and other cancers per se, but I think globally that's actually really important. It's probably not been captured so far by the evidence that we presented.
How many of that data is controlled by the fact that alcohol drinkers tend to smoke also? Right?
Yeah.
So that also co-factor risk.
No, I mean these are Oh, I see what you're saying. You mean concomitant risk.
Exactly,
Yeah.
so the risk is, so it's contributing more, the fact that they smoke or the fact that they drink alcohol?
That I think is difficult. to say. Okay. Thanks, JP.
Thank you.